This is a tutorial on the California Residential Purchase Agreement revised July of 2024 to be used in the post-NAR settlement era that's beginning August 17th. And we're going to cover the seller payment of buyer's broker form because this is now an integral part of how you're going to write an offer in order to secure your commission as this whole compensation model has changed. Now, when you export this form, you'll see the PDF is 27 pages. But don't fear because it's actually quite simple and we're going to go through it thoroughly yet very swiftly. So we'll start at the very top. And this is the disclosure regarding a real estate agency relationship. And you're going to put your client's name, your information, both of you sign. There's a second page and you don't have to do anything on the second page. And here we are at page 1 of the purchase agreement. Now we start by putting the date that we prepare the offer here, the name of our client, property street address, city, county, zip code, and then the assessor's parcel number, which is a unique identifier for all pieces of real estate issued by the county tax assessor that you can find on the MLS or through Realist or whatever tax records you have access to or through a property tax bill or from the seller. And if you really cannot find this number, you can leave it blank, but ideally you'll secure it. Okay, now we come down here to confirmation of who's representing whom. All right, so we have the seller's brokerage. We put the brokerage name here, the listing agent's name. We check the box seller and seller's agent. We write in their license numbers. Now this is the company or the brokerage license number, the listing agent's license number. I left it blank, but of course you'll find this on the MLS and you can just put in whatever you find here or even ask the listing agent. Then buyer's brokerage and the buyer's agent. I left this blank. Learn from my mistake. You want to check the buyer and buyer's agent, or if it's a dual agent, you check the dual agent box and you put the license numbers here. Pretty straightforward. Then we skip down here to the purchase price and we write in the number. If it's all cash, we check this box. Close of escrow. I check the box and I put 30 days, which is fairly customary. Of course, it can be more or less. More usually if there's a loan scenario or a contingency for placement property. Less with a cash buyer, for example. They might do 14 days or even 10 days if it's a cash buyer. But I'm just putting what's customary. Of course, you can check this box and put a definitive calendar date if you want. By default, this offer expires 3 calendar days. Just go ahead and leave it alone. Unless you really need to tighten up the time frame for a response, you can shorten it, but I'm showing you how I would fill this out and I leave that alone. Initial deposit amount, also known as the earnest money deposit or EMD, typically 1 to 3% of the sales price. I wrote in this number. It automatically calculates this percentage, which is a highly annoying feature of this form, but that's a different topic. I wrote in 15,000, just a made up arbitrary number for the sake of an example. But again, it's 1 to 3% of the sales price. Increased deposit is very rare and highly unlikely you will use this. You'll know if you need to because for whatever reason, your buyer will need to sweeten the deal. But it's highly unlikely you'll need to use this, so we'll skip on. You'll know if you need to use that. All right, we're pretending that this buyer is getting a loan for $800,000, which is 80%, and it's going to automatically calculate the percentage once you enter the numerical figure here. By default, it's a conventional loan. You could leave it alone just like this and move on. But you can also write in the rate not to exceed, or if there's points. Many agents leave this blank. Ideally, you don't leave things blank. It's not good to. But, I mean, this is not enforceable, so it's kind of a declaration. Quite frankly, it doesn't even belong here. But you can write it in if you have the info. Now, if you have any questions about anything relating to the loan, just call the loan officer and say, hey, let me run this by you. We're going to do this loan amount. Is that right? And it's conventional. Yes. They might correct you. Oh, no, we're doing an FHA. Or you can put in the rate. Hey, what's the highest rate that my buyer could possibly have to get? Well, we're not going to go over 7%, so you write in 7%. I mean, you can do that with guidance of a loan officer, but even if you left it like this, you'd be fine. If it's an FHA or VA loan, check these boxes. If there's seller financing involved, check that box. And this is for a second loan down here, which is less common, but maybe seller financing, or there is a second loan. You'll just fill this out the same way you did up here. By default, it's a primary residence occupancy type. If it's a secondary home, or an investment, you check those boxes. And then this is automatically calculated and we move on. Of course, the buyer is going to initial at the bottom of every page. Now, this section is where it gets interesting. And I should mention, by the way, this whole format here is what I call a grid or chart format, and it's a summary of key terms. You'll notice in this column here that this refers to a corresponding paragraph. The reason why is the way this form is built is that you have all these key terms that we're entering here, but if you scroll down, you have all the corresponding text. And all this is the same thing as what's up here. It's just the unabridged version. So you can look, okay, insurance. What does this mean? What are the implications? We go down to paragraph AD and we find more info. So that's how this is formatted. All right, so we go here to the seller credit. Now, this is typically when a buyer needs some help from the seller to cover the cost to close escrow, like closing costs, for example. And you'll check this box and write in a figure, and it automatically calculates that percentage. But agents may be tempted to write in a number that's going to go toward the buyer's agent commission, and I don't recommend that. I think that this line should be used exclusively for a seller credit or concession, which is the same thing. You'll see the word concession used a lot now. A concession's effectively a credit. It's the same thing. It has the same utility in a transaction. So if your buyer needs a seller credit for closing costs or for repairs, check this box. But if not, leave it alone, because to get paid, you're going to check this box. This is what I recommend here. You're going to check seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement, and then it incorporates the SPBB form. And I'll give you a sneak peek. This is what it's referring to, a simple one-page form, and that's where the buyer's agent's securing their commission. Now, there's one warning I'll give you here about this. You must have a buyer representation agreement in place. If you do not have a buyer representation agreement, you cannot use this. You can't check this box and use this SPB form because it nullifies it right here. This right here will make your SPBB form null and void. And if that's the case, there's a problem. Now, let's talk a little bit more about how you get paid and your compensation. Ideally, you're going to have a buyer representation agreement simply because there's a requirement that prior to touring a property with the buyer client, you have one in place, and that buyer representation agreement is going to have your commission on it. Now, if for whatever reason you didn't ever or cannot secure a buyer representation agreement before you're writing an offer, maybe the buyer had already gone through the open house without an agent and they're calling you to write an offer because now they want you to represent them. Whatever the case may be, of course, you'll want to propose a buyer representation agreement. But let's say for whatever reason you don't have one. Well, you have a couple options here. You can write in here some verbiage such as seller shall pay buyer's broker a commission of 2.5% of the sales price at close of escrow. Something to that effect here. Or I'm going to scroll down to other terms, and you can write that in here. Seller shall pay buyer's broker a commission of 2.5% of the sales price at close of escrow, or something to that effect. That alone will get you paid. That's the down and dirty, straightforward way to have the seller pay if the buyer's not paying. Maybe they're splitting it. Who knows? It can be anything, but you can write it in the additional finance terms or other terms. You can write it in there. I'm just saying this because ideally you're going to use this SPB form that and I'll go through that form once we get through the RPA. But if you can't, that's the alternative. All right. Now we come down to, so this form by default really is, most of it's customary in terms of what the best practices are. So we've already entered a lot of what you have to actually do, and we're going to go through this. I'll show you what else we have to do, but I'm just showing you that a lot of this is boilerplate text, and you can just kind of scroll through it because you're safe in terms of what the default verbiage is. The default verbiage already implies what's customary. So even if you leave something blank, you're likely to err and be okay. All right, so it asks here about proof of funds and lender pre-approval letter, and it's saying that by default it's attached to the offer. Best practices dictates that you send proof of funds for cash, enough to cover the buyer's down payment and closing costs, or if it's a cash offer, all the amount needed to make a cash purchase. And so if they're getting a mortgage, you should attach that. If for whatever reason you can't, check this box and it gives you 3 days after acceptance to deliver these documents, which are just proof of funds. This is proof of funds for cash transactions, proof of funds for a mortgage transaction, and then a lender pre-qualification letter. Ideally, you'll just attach it with the offer, and you don't have to change anything here if that's the case. All right, and then by default, I mean, you could in theory leave all of this alone unless you have to change it. But let's talk about when you'd have to change it. So this just gives you 5 days before close of escrow for a final walkthrough. No one does anything with this. They leave it alone. Assignment requests, very rare. If you're doing an assignment, you'll know, but you can leave this alone. I'm showing you just how I would fill this out as a very seasoned broker. I'm just showing you how to write an offer very quickly. Loan. You have 3 major contingency periods in a transaction. You have loan and appraisal and buyer investigations. If the buyer is paying with cash, I mean, you don't even need the loan and appraisal contingencies. You can check these boxes because there's no loan. It's a cash purchase. And the only time people get appraisals outside of probate type transactions is when the lender requires it. So you can check this box, no appraisal, if you don't need one on a cash purchase. If not, leave it alone and you have a 17-day contingency period by default. Now, sometimes agents shorten this. Sometimes they'll want to sweeten the deal or get things moving very quickly, maybe just to show that they're more aggressive with their timelines. They're faster than another buyer they're competing with, so they might reduce this down to 14 days or 10 days. Just keep in mind, if you're going to get more aggressive, if you're going to change anything here, run it by the lender first. Now, investigations. So these are all buyer investigations. These are all buyer due diligence items that they've parsed out. This is see how it's all 17 days? It's 17 days for the buyer to review all the elements, to investigate all the things pertaining to the sale, the title report, HOA disclosures. Is there a leased item like solar? What are the seller disclosures going to say? You have 17 days here. If you want to shorten this, you can just go through and reduce the number all across here. If not, leave it alone at 17 days, which is standard, and you're fine. So you'll know if you need to change this, but even if you leave it alone to the default 17, you'll be fine. All right, you can leave this alone. Upon notice of recordation, they say. That's kind of odd. Upon notice of recording, the buyer will be able to take possession. Leave it alone. And seller occupied units, if this is the case, you'll know because you'll have to check this box and you'll do a seller in possession form, or if there's tenants, you'll check this box and you'll know. You'll know if it's occupied after the close of escrow. So I would say that you diverge from the default text only when there are special circumstances, and you'll know when those special circumstances apply to you. You can leave all this alone. You can leave all this alone right here. Have the buyer initial and just move on. Items included. Check as much as possible that pertains. Don't leave it out. You don't want to some of this is so silly because this is, a dishwasher is part of real property given its nature of being affixed to the premises. But whatever, it's written out. You're going to go through, you're going to check as much as possible. You're going to include anything that is a personal item that should otherwise be excluded, but you want it included too. You want something like the garden gnome included. You want something like the patio furniture in the backyard to be included. Go ahead and write that in. Excluded items, are there things that should be included with the sale, like the chandelier, but you don't want it? It's ugly. You have your own that you're going to put in there, so you want the seller to take it and get it out of there? Well, you can check that box and write it here. And if there's not enough room, attach an addendum. Your agent, or you as an agent having a conversation with your buyer is going to give you an idea of what you need to edit here. It's pretty simple stuff. NHD, required by law, cannot be waived. Seller almost always pays. check environmental, write in a company. There should not be a checkbox here. Check it anyway, though. They should not put a checkbox here. This is silly. And then I wrote in our preferred vendor. Optional wildlife disclosure report. See this? My eyes are focusing on optional, so I'm not doing it. Now, I guess if you have a client that's completely neurotic about wildfires, which is fairly reasonable given that this state catches on fire every year now, you could get one, but you're going to have a wildfire risk in the NHD up here. Do you need this? No. But if you want to go over the top and do a little dog and pony show for your client, you can get the optional wildfire disclosure report. I think this thing is just totally added on just as a revenue generating mechanism. I don't really see the benefit. All right. Now, reports, other ones, termite, you could write that in. And seller typically pays for a termite report. You'll ask for any repairs after you review the report later down the road on the request for repair form. Is there another report that you want? I actually cannot stand how this is formatted here. I'm giving this tutorial and I'm going through this form and I'm just cringing at so many things, but I'm going to try to stay on topic here for the sake of time. But termite report, good thing to have. Write it in here. Have the seller pay. You'll address it in the request for repairs. All right. Smoke alarm, CO2 detector, water heater bracing. Requirements by law. Have the seller do it. Check the seller box. I won't give you a whole explanation here, but check the seller box. Move on. This is an area for contention because I see a lot of agents counter this out. I'll explain why without going too in depth, but you have these two lines. One is for point of sale requirements because like some cities, for example, require an inspection or a report to be issued about, let's say, permits upon point of sale, meaning it must be done before a transaction closes. And then down here, you have corrective remedial actions. These kind of work in conjunction because you might have a city come out and inspect because the city requires it, and then they might find something that is not up to code, and they might request a corrective action. Here's the problem with it. So this, I see it both ways. Should the seller be responsible? Well, yes, the seller should, because it's the seller's property. Until the close of escrow, they own it. So why would the buyer ever be responsible for a corrective action, let's say? Why? Why would the buyer do a corrective action, pay for repairs, bring a property up to code, if the seller still owns it and in theory could fall out of escrow? Why would you work on someone else's house? It makes no sense. Now, I understand from the seller's perspective, a seller doesn't want to say, sure, I'll pay for it. And then the city say, yeah, it'll be $45,000 to correct it. Please pay up, please go hire a contractor, pay permitting fees and spend $45,000. That's disqualifying. Why would the seller sign a blank check? So for those reasons, I totally get why this is left blank, which I did here. I left it blank, but, and I understand why they're countered out. If you leave it blank and this comes up, you'll have to deal with it. You're just kicking the can down the road. But this is an area of contention. That's why I left it blank. We're moving on. Escrow. I'm filling this out in the form of Southern California because it's very uniform. In Northern California, it changes. It varies county to county on who pays what. I'm going to bring this over very quickly. I'm going to show you a little grid, a little cheat sheet. And this tells you who pays what in what county. I'll link to this in the description, the cheat sheet. But you can see like in some of these other counties, it changes who pays what. Southern California is very uniform though. Each party pays their own. It used to be both, but now they added this verbiage. And then the name of the escrow company, and then title insurance in Southern California. The seller pays title insurance. Of course, in Northern California, it varies. And then I wrote in ABC Title because in Southern California, escrow and title are usually not the same company. Sometimes they are. Most of the time, they're not. In Northern California, title and escrow are the same company. The title company does escrow. Of course, this is all negotiable. Everything in here is negotiable. I'm just showing you what's customary and what's typical. And quite frankly, I think that the escrow division within a title company is the better way to go. All right, just some little opinion editorial here as we go through it. All right, default county transfer tax. This is statewide, so check seller. There might be an exception on this sheet. It says county transfer tax. Seller pays, seller pays, seller pays. yeah, you can see that throughout the state, the seller pays that. Okay, county transfer tax. In Southern California, you always check seller. I just want to double check. Now, do cities have transfer tax? Well, many do. I mean, it shows you on here, and this is actually kind of dated, but it gives you an idea. I mean, you can see certain cities require it. If that's the case, check the appropriate box. And this is already filled in for you. HOA transfer, check seller, move on. Is there a private transfer fee? Maybe there is in like a special neighborhood, there might be some sort of like co-op or gated community that has some sort of unique thing going where there's a private transfer fee. You'll know if that's the case. I wrote this in. Now, you don't have to do this, but I'm showing you what you can do. You can have your client pay your transaction coordinator fee or a broker fee or some credit to offset your obligation to pay your broker. You write it in here, you can check this box, and that's how you add another fee to offset your costs to do business. All right, we'll move down here to, by the way, one side note, you could actually write in your commission here. Remember how I showed you how to ask for a commission from the seller or the buyer? Either party can pay your commission, totally negotiable. But you can put this in here and you can check this box. It's just, there's no space here. And I don't like how this is formatted at all. It used to be formatted way better a few years ago, but all good things must come to an end, as they say. All right, home warranty. So seller to pay, very common. You can find a number by going to a home warranty provider's website and doing a quick estimate, very easy. And you should have the buyer choose. Why? Because the buyer's the one stuck dealing with their customer service. You don't want some buyer to hate their home warranty companies. And 99% of people hate home warranty companies. I mean, go look up any home warranty company. They all have horrible reviews online. Everyone hates their home warranty company. So why do you want to choose randomly? You don't care. The seller doesn't care. Why would you want the seller to choose? And then the buyer be upset because they think the seller shafted them with this horrible, god-awful home warranty company. So put in buyer's choice so they have no one but themselves to blame if they're unhappy with the home warranty company. If it's waived, check this box. Cash transactions, sometimes that's the case. Other terms, you can use it for whatever you want, including buyer's agent compensation. Buyer's going to initial, we move on. So we're done with the grid or the matrix part. That's it. The form is, we're 90% done here. I'm just showing you now that this right here is just repeating what we've already gone through. This section right here, and I'll just kind of narrate it as we skim through it quickly, but this incorporates additional forms if they pertain to your unique circumstances. You'll know it as you read through here. Does this apply to me? Does this apply to me? And you'll check the box if it does. Then we move on, and these are explanations. These are the reference paragraphs to this column here that shows you where to find more information. So again, we're just repeating the same terms we talked about. What are the implications of contingencies, removal contingencies? As a broker, when I get really difficult questions about a dispute in the middle of a transaction, this is where I'll go and I'll read very carefully every word in here to see what the implications are to solve the dispute. So that's the benefit of this. Again, your client's going to initial each page. We're moving on. We're going through it quickly. We're initialing each page. Cancellation, talk about cancellation. And I mean, you can read it if you want. You could go on for ad infinitum reading all this. I mean, this is just, you could spend hours and hours studying this form. All right, buyer initial, but to write an offer, you don't need to. I'm showing you exactly how to do it. Initial, we're on page 10 of 17. Good Lord, this thing is so long. We're scrolling through. We get down to liquidated damages. And this basically says that if the buyer defaults, the seller can obtain or retain the earnest money deposit. Parties initial here, we move on. Mediation by default to solve disputes. And then you have to elect arbitration, which I recommend. I recommend that there are 3 initials by your client on this page. We're on page 14 of 17. Have your client initial that. We're moving on. Okay, now we come down to the signature page. If you have an entity buyer, like a trust or corporation, LLC, whatever, check this box, write in the name of the legally authorized signer here, and they're going to sign. And we move on. This is pretty straightforward. Seller's going to sign if they accept. You're going to sign down here. You're going to put in the rest of your information and you're going to sign. All right, let's keep going. Okay, now we're on page 20 of 27. The good news is the rest of it is just boilerplate text. Look at this. Buyer investigation advisory. Buyer signs. Possible representation of more than one buyer. You and the buyer sign. Fair housing. I mean, these are just CYA advisories, disclosures, disclaimers. Buyer homeowner insurance advisory. It's hard to get homeowners insurance in California now because of those fires I was talking about. All right, buyer signs. We move on. Wire fraud advisory. Consumer privacy. Okay, and we're done. That's it. That's the offer. We're going to jump over here, wrap this up. You're going to fill this out. By default, it's made part of the purchase agreement. You put the date of the purchase agreement. That's in the top left corner of page 1. Put all this information here. Very straightforward. Then you're going to put your commission amount, 2.5%. or whatever it is. Now keep in mind that you're boxed in with your commission. When you're using all these forms, not only must you have a buyer representation agreement to use this. If you don't have one, you can't use this form. But also, whatever is on your buyer representation agreement is the max that you can collect. So you can't put like 0.25% on your buyer representation agreement and then write in 2.5% here and then think, okay, well, I won that buyer over by offering them something super low so that buyer would sign the representation agreement. But don't worry, I'll make it up by having the seller pay me what I really want. It doesn't work that way. The most you can get paid by the seller is what the buyer is offering to pay you in the representation agreement. I hope that makes sense. But you're going to put that number in here. It's going to match your representation agreement. You're going to have your client sign. Look, the seller's going to sign too. The seller's going to get a copy of that buyer representation agreement. There can be no funny business. All those loopholes got closed. So you have to be transparent and straightforward. It's really not a big deal, quite frankly. You just need to write it in there and be assertive. You need to just put your foot down and say, this is my commission. I don't work for free. The end. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.